Yeah, but we don't call that a
It's now 10:55 a.m. I'd like to call this meeting of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission back into session. We are reconvening after a brief recess, and at this time we will be having a presentation from Mr. Doug Johnson of the Rose Institute. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you very much. Check in. I don't know if I just emailed this over to the staff late last night, so I don't know if it got posted or not. But
I haven't confirmed that it's been posted, but it was requested to be posted by the time you presented. So
I can confirm it's been posted on the redistrictingca.org site, so it's there now.
Okay. And then we have a couple more copies if anyone in the public did not get a copy. Thank you. So,
there are seats available back here.
Oh, yes.
If the members of the public would like to join us back here, that way we have one screen that can only be viewed from this direction. We do have some extra chairs up here. You're more than welcome to join us.
We have a shy public today. That won't last, I can assure you. So thank you once again for the opportunity to address you and hopefully share some information that'll help kind of mainly prepare you for the different stages that are coming along. That's really my goal here, is to give some general information about California redistricting, the background of the last couple decades, kind of set the stage so that both you and the public have a sense of what led to this, very briefly. And as you go through the bumps and bruises of this process, because there certainly will be bumps and bruises, so that everyone keeps in mind, however bumpy it is, it's much better than it was before. Then my primary goal today is kind of to talk through the different phases of redistricting that every kind of public commission does go through, so that you have a sense as you're looking to your outreach plan of a little more substance and a little more details of what will be going on as you set each of these dates and events. And then there was some commentary in past meetings about looking for definitions of different criteria, maybe ways of elaborating on what's in the language of the Constitution. And it just so happens that for the Arizona Redistricting Commission, they had a similar request, and we compiled a whole range of academic and judicial statements on definitions of things like community of interest and stuff like that. So I've put those all in here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading them or anything like that. I just want to get them really in your hands.
Mr. Johnson, I just have one comment before you move in. I'm not sure how you've weighted your presentation. We did give you some feedback to focus on the meat and less on the background about Rose Institute or yourself. We know you're very well qualified. Otherwise, you wouldn't be sitting in front of us right now. So thank you.
Yes, I definitely understand. The first page, just because this is breaking news from yesterday, wanted to throw out, the Institute did just launch a new site, redistrictingamerica.org. It's not focused on California, it's the whole country. But if you want to see what's going on in other states, here's a great place to do it. And again, the details are on the web and in front of you. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay. So one thing, I've talked about, I have a lot of experience at this. I'm certainly not the only one. One thing I would encourage this commission to do is really to ask a lot of other people to come in and share similar insights about their experiences in redistricting, how that might apply to your experience. Obviously, all of us come from different backgrounds. Redistricting is always controversial, and there will always be controversy around everyone that has ever been involved in this process. So you should take each of our advice with a grain of salt, but you're a lot better off getting 10 people's advice. So this is a quick list of Californians, really, plus the Arizona Commission, who have been through this process, I think in all the cases multiple times. And some of them may not be willing to speak to you. They may still work for the parties or things like that. Or they may work for the parties and still be happy to talk with you. But if you're looking for other input, rebuttal, whatever you're looking for, here's a whole list of people you can go to. Like I said, I won't spend a lot of time on the Rose Institute, but we've been around since '73 working on this stuff. we are focused, our main mission is providing experiences in real-world research and demographics and redistricting for our students. And we do have 23 undergrads, 1 graduate student, there's 2 fellows, one of them is me, and then an administrative assistant, associate director, and director. So it's a pretty big team. We're actually I think we're the biggest or second biggest of the 11 institutes at Claremont McKenna College, each on totally different topics. And we put out a lot of documents. We have the Claremont College's digital archive, where we have all of our publications since 1973 online. This is just a quick snapshot of things from case studies of 1990s. Actually, Tony Quinn, who you've heard from a number of times, wrote for us Carving Up California, which is a history of California redistricting from the 50s through the 80s. There's all kinds of stuff on there. And, of course, we've done appearances in gerrymandering and on television, all that kind of stuff. In one of our most recent studies that a lot of people have been talking about, and you've probably seen in the press, we did a study of population projections and looking at the population shifts. And this map is the county by county, a shift in how many assembly districts and senate districts and congressional districts each region is expected to get. Now, the key thing here is that numbers don't necessarily translate directly into seats, but this report is online, and it has formed a lot of the newspaper commentary you've been seeing. And then you've heard some of my background. I just threw some of the details in there for you. But let me get into the meat of this. So first, very briefly, looking a little bit back, modern redistricting we refer to really started with the one-person, one-vote rulings in the 60s. So really everything we're talking about in redistricting started in the 70s. And California has been on a roller coaster. In the 70s, the legislature deadlocked with then Governor Reagan. They couldn't get a plan, and the court stepped in and drew a plan. It was very interesting because the Republicans were pushing hard for deadlock, knowing they weren't going to get much out of a legislative plan. They got what they thought was a great fair plan in 73. Watergate hit in 74, and that fair plan led to their wipeout in 74. But the hallmark of a fair plan, as Prop 13 and Reagan came around in 78 and 80, the district swung back. That really is the goal of this, is that as the voter opinions swing, so does representation. Then in 81, we had a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor. They drew a plan. They actually picked up 5 congressional seats in the plan. Very controversial, and the voters actually qualified a referendum. And you may have heard snippets of this, but usually referendum kills the bill, and everyone thought the court would follow the 1970s precedent and put their own plan in place. Instead, then Supreme Court Chief Justice Byrd Court took the referendum plan and put it in place anyways. Extremely controversial. It helped kill the initial bill. The voters did vote down the Assembly, Senate, and congressional plans. But all of us in the reform community, not so much me at the time, I wasn't doing a lot in 73, or in 81 even, but the reform community really learned it doesn't do much good to throw the plan out if you leave the same people in charge of redrawing it. And the plan was then immediately redrawn, and in a small world coincidence, it was the last act of then Governor Brown, as he left office and Duke Majan came in, to sign the replacement plan into law and essentially lock in that 81 plan. That led to a whole bunch of reform initiatives, all of which failed that decade. And in 91, we again had one party in the legislature and a different party in the governor's office. They deadlocked, and we had the 1990s plan. Very widely praised plan. The court drew it, obviously. And in 94, we had the Republican national wave, and Republicans actually picked up, very briefly, a majority of the Assembly, thanks to that national wave of voter sentiment. And then as especially California, even more than the rest of the country, went back to the left as the decade went on, the Democrats picked virtually all those seats back up. And again, that plan was swinging back and forth, kind of the goal that I think everyone's hoping for here. And then in 2001, you know that story all too well. Bipartisan gerrymander, both parties got together, and when 2006 and 2008, 2010 came around, there was no change. And this gets colorful. You've gotten a little taste of the passions that surround this issue in the inside world. I'll give you a brief, even more colorful example, which is 1980. Some of you may remember Leo McCarthy and Howard Berman were battling for the speakership of the Assembly. They've spent millions in backing their candidates in the Democratic primaries. And then, in something that's hard to believe now looking back, Willie Brown and the Latino caucus in the Assembly joined with the Republican caucus to elect Willie Brown Speaker. Now, it's hard looking back to remember that the Republicans actually put Brown in the speakership. And they got outmaneuvered. Willie Brown knew all along that redistricting was coming. And here he had his rivals, Berman and McCarthy, in the Assembly, obviously a big power threat, said, Mr. Berman, how would you like a congressional seat? Mr. McCarthy, I will be your biggest fundraiser in your lieutenant governor's race. And boom, used redistricting to send off Berman and his lieutenants, send off McCarthy, and we had what began Willie Brown's reign. And if you have him come in, he can tell you in much more colorful detail how redistricting played into that. The famous quote that is always great is, he was talking about Berman and McCarthy and said, they spent their millions on campaigns, I spent mine on clothes, and look who's speaker. He also, this relates to the Rose Institute's background, there were two computers in '81 in the state that could do redistricting. One was in the legislature and one was in the Rose Institute. And we had a grant from the Business Roundtable to do public education, public outreach, really media training, and to draw kind of a comparison plan. When Phil Burton revealed his plans, he actually didn't give any details. He simply showed the outlines of each district proposed with no demographics or politics or anything. And the Rose Institute turned that around 24 hours later and said, here's the demographics. Brown was a little upset that it happened, and the Israelis had just taken out the Iraqi nuclear power plant, and that led to his line that all our students love, which is, I've contacted the Israeli Air Force to talk to them about Claremont. So this gets very colorful very, very quickly. Phil Burton called those lines his contribution to modern art, and you still hear that phrase very often. So let's jump ahead now. I talked about the competition in these plans and how really the goal is for districts to swing. And this is fairly easy to look at retrospectively. It's very hard to predict competitiveness going forward, but it's fairly easy to look back. You just see which ones changed. In the 90s, we had 16 assembly districts change hands. 8 of them actually changed hands twice. In the state Senate, 7 of the 40 districts changed hands. And in Congress, 10 changed hands. And the 11th, actually my old boss, Steve Horn, he won it every year, but never by more than 2.5%. So there was really 11 competitive congressional seats. Compare that now to, we just had, in the last 2 cycles, 5 assembly districts finally changed hands at all. We had 1 congressional seat change hands. It really shows the numbers how this plan locked in the incumbents on both sides. It was a very bipartisan plan. Then on the next, you've heard about some of this already, but minority representation, you can really see how the 1990 plan, all the minority numbers really jumped under the court-drawn plan. And then in the current decade, the numbers have not increased. There was some negotiations, for example, for Latinos. In the redistricting, they actually drew 2 new Latino seats, and those were won by Latinos. But then nothing changed. As the Latino population in California has become more and more of a percentage over the decade, they have literally not picked up in a single assembly, state senate, or congressional district. They have the same number they had in 2002. And you can see the other numbers for African Americans and Asian Americans in there. That really, as much as the competitiveness is what the public responds to and the media responds to, this is really amazing numbers, in my view, of how this current plan locked in the incumbents. So that's just some quick background. This is good. I'm making good time through this. And feel free to ask questions, too, especially in this next stage as we get into the real meat of what I'm hoping will be useful for you. Again, I've worked with the Arizona Commission. I worked with the Modesto Independent Redistricting Commission as well. And it's a very interesting dynamic as you go through this. First, they both did public input rounds. Neither one of them did what you're talking about education outreach meetings, but there's a definite dynamic in these. The general public struggles to know what to say. They struggle to say how they define their community. Some enthusiasts and interested parties will try, and what they give you is incredibly valuable. And the other piece is that the organized groups, the MALDEFs, the Asian Pacific Legal Center, or the coalition name that they have now, the Naleos, the green linings, they will show up, and they will give you very, very useful information because they've been preparing for this for 6 months. So it's a useful phase, but keep in mind the turnout will be low in these meetings. And it is hard for the public to come in and describe to you their neighborhoods when the goal of the commission is to keep entire counties together. So why are we looking at neighborhoods in Stockton if the goal is to keep the whole county together? Well, on a theoretical level, which is all you're at the public input stage, that's hard to do. There's another twist, though, is that other groups, you can't draw maps until you've done some public input hearings. Other groups will. And those public input hearings discussion will very quickly move to those maps. Because, as we'll talk about, it's a lot easier for the public to react to a map and say what they like and don't like. So even though these are supposed to be community definition, public input, no map sessions, keep in mind the testimony will very quickly go to any map that's submitted to you, or any maps. Hopefully you'll get a bunch. So these are useful, but don't over-expect what you're going to get out of them and how much turnout there's going to be. And really, my advice would be, you need to do them, but get your draft plan as fast as you possibly can, because that is when the public will show up. When you start doing public review sessions, then people see lines. Then people see the lines coming through their neighborhoods, coming through their cities. At some point, you're going to have to balance populations among the districts, and something's going to get split. And people will turn out. A rule of thumb that I put at the bottom here, if you get 10 people at an education outreach hearing, you'll probably get 50 at that same location for a public input hearing, and you'll get, I would say, at least 250 at the plan reaction map. This is part of the reason why I say get to the plan reaction maps as fast as you can, because that's when the public will show up, and you'll need as much time as you possibly can for that, as I'll talk about. The nice thing is that even in 2001, the organized groups that I talked about will show up with specific plan edits. They will have run your maps. They will have run everyone else's maps. And they'll come in and say, please adopt these changes to your map, which is very easy for you to deal with and accommodate and consider. The public will struggle. Some of them will be tech savvy, and now you have much better tools than we had 10 years ago. And some of them will jump into those tools and love it. Some will still struggle. This is a key part of your technical team, being able to work with the public, be able to work with someone who says, please keep my neighborhood together. Well, where is it? The LA Times did a fascinating study, an online mapping project where they asked people to define their neighborhoods, and they got thousands of comments. It's from, I think it was just City of LA even. And they did a great map, which shows shading for each neighborhood, like, for example, West Adams. 90% of people said this part is in West Adams. A little bit lighter shading. Half of them also included this. 10% of them also included this. I mean, that is the kind of dispute and testimony you're going to be getting, is where are the lines and how have you respected them. It's going to be interesting. And they won't really talk about it until there's a line through it. People will lay back. They've got other priorities. You got family, work, jobs, all that kind of stuff. So it's not until that line shows up and their friends start calling them that they'll come in. The other key challenge for you and for your technical team and for your web team, people will show up at meetings and think that you've heard them and been responsive and seem engaged. But everything in redistricting is ripples. Every change you make in Fresno will ripple down and probably affect LA. So when you do your LA hearing and someone thinks they've been heard, well, how do they keep track as you go to Fresno and San Francisco to see if something has changed that back there? That's a key challenge for you to get that messaging out and to give people the tools to be able to follow the request that they made and see, is it still in the plan? And if not, how do they get their word in? So, this is a suggestion for when you get to your plan review meetings. Some people have never been to a meeting. Most of them, actually, will have never been to any of your meetings. So you'll want to continue with the commission introduction. Give people, a little bit of background on the commission and education on what's going on and what are the rules that you're acting under. You'll want to have, as CCP has talked about, a standard presentation for this is how the public can engage, this is how you can share your thoughts. Then, as I'll talk about, your public input meetings in this phase and your business meetings will almost certainly start combining into one. at least your action on the maps business elements of this. You'll be giving direction to staff to say, okay, we just heard 10 people give commentary. These 9 seem like things we want to incorporate in the plan. Can you go test it? Virtually no one is going to come in and say, please unite my neighborhood by changing this over here. Everyone, 80 to 90% of your input is going to be, please unite my neighborhood and fix this split. Your direction to staff is going to be, okay, show us the options here. Can you fix this split, and what is the offset? Because it's very rare for the group to come in and have a specific trade for you. So every meeting, you're probably going to want to hear back from your staff about what they've been testing since the last one at your direction. How did it work out? And then you can either kind of hold off on everything or direct staff to kind of incorporate that into your working map. Now you have this 14-day delay. Your council will have to work on exactly how this is handled. 14-day publication of maps. I think a test of small changes isn't a new map, but you'll have to work with defining that. So the third piece of this would be staff reporting back on the last meeting, because a lot of the public will know what was asked and directed at the last meeting, and they'll want to know how it worked out. And then they'll react to it. And this is similar to what I said the other day about public input, public input. You have to keep coming back to the public and letting them back up to the mics, because they'll react to the staff presentation, and you'll want to hear that before you start reacting to what staff presented. Obviously you want to hear what the public who asked for a change thinks of the change when it's drawn. Oh, yes.
You're suggesting that the staff would present the current plans before the commission saw it? Or at the same time?
Probably at the same time, and I'll get into the timing on this, but yeah. Now, it's just staff reporting. It's not meaning the map has changed.
Okay.
But yes. So then you discuss it, and theoretically, I would suspect you will then direct staff, yes, we like how that came out. No, that had a really bad side effect over there. Never mind, or keep trying. Maybe the other direction to staff. And then after you give your direction, you want to hear from the public again. What's likely to happen is first you'll hear public comment on those tests and results, and then you'll hear ideally, then you would hear public comment on new tests that the public wants you to test on your map. So there's going to be a lot going on and a lot of people talking on different issues, and managing that is going to be very tough, and keeping straight what's going on at a given time is going to be tough. And one strong suggestion is all your other kind of administrative business, I would always put that at the end of these meetings, because the public, they love you, but they don't really want to sit through your discussion of the budget until they can tell you why you've split through their home neighborhood and why it should be put back together. It also, just as a practical matter, it will help you get through your business administrative items fast, because you'll all be exhausted. It just works out better. So I suggest putting that at the end, because these meetings really will merge. And then, Commissioner Brava, getting kind of to where you were coming from on this, one thing to keep in mind, you will have different teams working on these different maps. This process is going to be wild and crazy and fast. And you may have one contractor who has separate teams. You may go with multiple contractors who are teaming up and sharing teams in some way. But you will have different teams. Probably one drawing congressional, and if you decide to nest, one drawing the Assembly, Senate, and Board of Equalization map. If you decide not to nest, you may be able to balance that a little bit. And the staff, if you're going to get this done on time, they really have to be, in the background working every day, testing things out. They really want to get ahead of you and the public to know, so that when someone comes up and says, hey, you've got this city, that should be in this district and it's in there, can you fix that? And it's much better if your staff have kind of looked at all these different scenarios and can respond back saying, well, that probably would require doing one of these 3 things. And you can actually have that dialogue live in the meeting, because they can't give you exact numbers, but they can give you the idea of where you're going, and the public could say right then, oh, if those are my 3 ballparks, I'd prefer you do this one. So the more your staff can know what's coming and know where the bottlenecks are and know where the tough questions are, the better prepared they are. So they'll be working constantly to just test things out and play with things in the background, so they're ready to anticipate the questions. The key thing is that your staff teams will probably rotate out. These meetings can take a day or more per map. So congressional map, assembly map, if you're not nesting, state senate maps. Even if you are, there will be separate discussion about how to nest, and Board of Equalization maps. So in all likelihood, you'll end up doing kind of what Arizona did, which is, okay, the congressional staff team is here. Today is about Congress. Let's talk about the tests that you ran and evaluate them and decide whether or not. Meanwhile, the legislative map team is in the other room working on the instructions you gave them yesterday, kind of thing. So and in all likelihood, you'll probably have a third team because California is big, and you'll need a lot of work going on at the same time. And so you'll be in almost constant public hearings. Your staff will be rotating through as you deal with different maps through the process. And that's, Commissioner Bravo, that's why when I talk about, you're not really going to have much time to sit down with staff outside of these meetings to look at what they're working on, because while they're working on one plan, you're in here taking public comment and reacting to the other map and all like that. Now, you may be able to space out your time, but when it comes down to the deadlines, you're going to be constant. This is the next. Yeah, so I talked about the rotating plans. Oh, the last point here. So when you look at your schedule, and this is why I kind of requested to go before of your outreach meeting, when you look at your schedule and say, like May 24th, we want to have our draft maps out, that probably means staff needs to be presenting at least the first of those maps to you, like a week in advance. And then you'll need public hearings, and you'll get requests for changes to the draft map. And this is a key question for you, is do you want to just grab a draft, essentially give your staff general direction, let them come back to you with 1 or 2 or 3 variations of doing that direction, and just get your draft map out there and throw it out there without doing a lot of public input on that phase, just to get the baseline set for the public? Or do you want to have a full staff show you their scenarios, the public reacts, you react, you request changes before you adopt that May 24th map, if that's the date you stick with? But keep in mind, you've got this multi-day process, either way, of presenting and getting public reaction before you have adopted your draft map. And how does that relate to your public input meeting schedule? And how does that relate to your reaction schedule? And as Commissioner Antaya has talked about, with a 14-day delay, you really only have a chance for, I think it's 2 or 3 rounds of full maps. So you've got to be careful to schedule in your public input with the knowledge that not only that, but it's going to take you 3 or 4, 5 or 6 days to adopt each round of those maps.
Mr. Johnson, I just wanted to let you know we're about halfway through your time, not quite halfway through the PowerPoint, and I know we wanted to prioritize questions and discussion.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, one thing, about half of the PowerPoint is the definitions at the end, and I'm not really going to go through those. Those are just to get them in your hands.
Great, thank you.
So, yeah. For those looking ahead and scared I was going to read all those, I'm not going to. So this is the heart and meat of this presentation right here. So that's the main thing, and that's why I really, and I talked to CCP people, and they agreed that it made sense to do this before you get into your schedule so that you can take these thoughts into mind of how you schedule your business mapping meetings. And they really will. Once your draft map is out there, they'll just merge with your input meetings, and you won't really have different kinds of meetings. As much as you might want to. It just won't work. If you schedule a business meeting, people will show up to talk about your map. And so just plan for that. Line drawing for the public. This is just a quick intro to what's out there. We actually demoed this at the Redistricting California forum that they held a few weeks ago down in LA. There are some very good free tools out there now. Google Maps. Google Map Maker, which is in beta right now and not yet live, but you can see it, and if they launch it before your draft maps come out, it's a great tool. It actually lets the public, instead of printing a Google map and drawing a line on it, it actually lets them click, 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 and add a layer onto a Google map and hit share, and send it right over to you. Yeah, they're not tied into blocks and tracks and all that. It's not giving you numbers, but it lets them draw their neighborhood or their community and show you right there in Google on your browser. And you can play with it now. It just doesn't save what you're doing. Then Google Earth. which is a free program, and I was going to demo it, but the internet connection is here really slow. But Google Earth is a free download that gives you amazing detail and amazing overlays of data, and that allow people to really show you what they're talking about. I did a demo of Google Earth at a conference where people who had actually drawn the 2001 plan were there, and talked about how the Ribbon of Shame district that runs along Santa Barbara, they had made the claim in court, it was kind of silly even then, that this was a coastal community of interest. But at this conference, I took the district, and Google Earth flew in to the valley, inland to Santa Maria, that's supposedly in the coastal district. And now with Google Street View, you can actually show cows. It's like, really? And then flew around to Ventura, where the district is only 400 feet wide, and homes that are 500 feet from the beach are not in the coastal district. And he later at a separate conference said, if Google Earth had been around, we never would have gotten away with that district. These tools are amazing. The key thing, though, is your consultant team needs to be familiar with them, because your consulting team needs to put out the demographic data and the plan layers in formats that people can then click and put them on their Google Map viewer and download them into their Google Earth. So these are things that you should be familiar with. And then Bing and Arc Explorer from ESRI are very, very similar tools to Google Earth and Google Maps, the same functionality. But again, your consultant team needs to be familiar with how to get these maps out there and how to share them. Because in Google Maps, you can pull it up just like all of you have done to get directions. And if you log into Google with any free account, this commission can share all of its plans, and people can look at the districts. There's a limit to how big they can be in Google Maps, so people may have to go to Google Earth to look at the whole state, but they can pull up individual districts without any trouble. So the basics, that's all free. That doesn't cost anyone, any of the public, anything, and now they can come in and show you, this is where I want the line drawn. Then there's more complicated tools that people have used in the past or that are brand new. Public participation kits are extremely useful at the local level. They're much harder to use at the state level because it's just so darn big. But you can put out paper and Excel kits of track level data, or even block group or block level data, and let people draw their own plans. It's tough to do for the state, but it is something that could be a handy tool for the public that want to draw a district in their area. Give them a kit for their area, and that gives them a manageable size data set. And then more likely, given California's complexity, there's obviously the regional assistance centers that you've heard a lot about that are great. That's a very good resource for people that can get into those and actually get technical help. And then there's now these online redistricting tools that Mr. Claypool was talking about in the budget discussion. There's really two kind of top-of-line ones, one from ESRI and Maptitude, that are fully functional. You can really draw a whole plan, using, in the Maptitude's case, using all of the tools that are in the desktop software. Now it's online, it's going back and forth to the server, it's not as fast as the desktop, but it gives the public the ability to do it. And then there's another group called the Public Mapping Project that is trying to, they've developed a tool that, they're offering it for free to jurisdictions, and you can tell it's a very limited functionality, but the idea is there. And then the people that helped with the census outreach, that built the website for the California Census Outreach, are in the process of seeing if they can develop an online redistricting tool too. So these options are out there. I definitely would encourage using them. When we all saw the 35,000 applicants for this commission, we all thought, wow, 35,000 people trying to hit an online redistricting server. That's going to be difficult. So there may have to be some arrangements around that.
Commissioner Anchetta. Yes, please do.
Actually, there's this website called, I think it's Dave's Redistricting, but it's actually a pretty good program for drawing, at least for drawing congressional districts. I don't think he's doing legislative districts, but it's actually pretty good. I think I've played with it a little bit. It looks pretty good. Do you have any opinion on that particular one?
Yeah, it's a handy kind of big picture scenario drawer. It was using track data. I think now they're using block group data, but it's not robust enough to handle blocks. But yeah, it's a very handy tool to kind of draw scenarios and come up with that for people to play around with numbers. And it's really one guy. That's the amazing thing. Now he's a Microsoft programmer, so he's got some experience. And
it is open. It's open. It's free, right? So there's no cost to using that that particular.
Yes.
And it's not an endorsement of it, but it's just one of those that are free that are available.
Yes, and it's been mentioned in some of the articles already of people playing around with what could happen in California. And if you see those articles, most of them are coming from that tool. And it is a rough numbers kind of thing. They don't have the statewide database data. They have some approximate data. But yeah, so and I expect there will be a couple more of these coming out there. But there is definitely a leap in capability when you go from these kind of free options versus the ESRI and Maptitude options in terms of what people can do and how quick they can do them. The Maptitude actually has the advantage of it links directly into your tech consultant's computer. So when a plan is drawn, boom, it's on your tech team's computer, which is a big plus too. And your tech team can hit a button and send your next plan right out on the web instantly. So it is. Orange County actually has done an interesting thing. They looked at Maptitude for redistricting, the online redistricting, and they looked at the potential server load of all these people. So what they're doing is actually getting Maptitude online redistricting, but limiting access to the server to just certain locations. I think they're doing a whole bunch of city halls and libraries. So it's available. It is integrated with the consultants' laptops. And really, the software is fairly easy. Librarians can almost support this kind of thing, even if they're not that tech savvy. And so that's a way of dealing with the server load issue, too. So you'll need to look into how do we keep the server from crashing when 35,000 people try to draw a plan at once. Another piece of that is, while all these systems can be used for the public to view your maps, if they just want to zoom in on their neighborhood and see exactly where the line is, now that's standard. Just, you throw a web server up there with the GIS system and people can zoom in and see roads and streets and schools and cities and all that stuff. That should be on a separate server. So the people that are looking to view the maps aren't taking the server load from the people who are trying to draw the maps, because they're going to need every ounce of CPU power they can get. So that's the kind of heart and soul of this. One piece that I thought might be useful, because I've heard you discussing it and wrestling with this quite a bit, in terms of what you're looking for from the public, there's really 4 questions, and that's really what you want the public to tell you in terms of communities of interest. 1, what is your geographic community? And be sure and tell them that you want geographic. People will come in, we all identify with all kinds of communities, but if it's not geographic, it can't be drawn in the map, so, there's not enough time on your schedule already. Second, do they want it kept together or divided among multiple districts? 95% will say kept together. The only groups that really come in and want multiple districts are really big retirement communities who know that they will essentially dominate both seats if they're divided. But there are some communities that like having two people that they can go to. And if one shuts the door on them, they can go to another one, and they're okay with getting diluted. But ask. You never know until they tell you. And many of your communities won't have even thought about it until you ask them. Okay, that's your community. Do you want to be kept together? Do you want to be separate? We actually had groups in Arizona testify one way and then come back 3 weeks later and say we thought about it and we changed our mind. We'd actually like 2 districts, please. Then 2 questions. The third one in the list is obvious. Once you draw your community, okay, which one should you be with? For example, Imperial County, obviously a community of interest. They'll come in. It makes every sense in the world to keep them together. But does it make more sense for them to go with Riverside County or with San Diego County? Nowadays there's a lot of arguments both ways. Hopefully they'll share which way is their preference. And then there's one that is always touchy, but actually when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Which neighboring communities should your community not be with? It sounds so negative, but really it makes a lot of sense. For example, if you have a group coming in saying we are, where I used to live, the Pico Union neighborhood, it's recent immigrants, low turnout, educating the public and engaging the public in the process is difficult. Should they be put with Beverly Hills? No. They should be put with other areas. You don't want to put an area with another population that's going to swamp them. Unless there's no way to do it. But that's the last question is, where do you just not have the same issues? When you're going to a legislator, you're talking A and they're talking B, and you really don't have any connection between your communities, and it would make more sense for you to have separate voices. The example you've all heard about so much is the Hopi and the Navajo in Arizona. But there are many, many examples of this. So it's a tough question to put on the list, and everyone says, oh, that's so negative. But it really does give you useful information. Now, format of the input. Obviously, if you have a standard format that the public follows, fantastic. It does make everything easier, especially if they're drawing maps and using the tech tools and sending it in a given way. But remember, the public just doesn't, they're hard to engage in redistricting. I mean, we've seen that already in your meetings, that the turnout isn't overwhelming. And obviously, I would suggest that any format or guidelines be suggestions, requests, but take it anyway, in any form that they want to give it to you. Your tech team will have been around the block enough times to deal with anything, whoever you end up choosing. So the other piece, too, is that they can follow up, especially with input that comes in writing, and I bet at least half of your input will actually come in writing. So, your tech team can always write back and say, hey, you drew 3 sides of your neighborhood, what's the 4th? Or your staff can write back. It's all public records and all that. If they're in the live meeting, obviously, hopefully, their staff or you guys will notice that they didn't finish the square and ask the public. But if they're writing in, you need to be able to follow up. This one point I kind of went over earlier. This is the whole issue of the public likes something to react against. It's a lot easier for them to say, I like that, no, that's wrong, than it is for them to come in and describe this vague community of interest idea. This gets back to the idea of get to your draft plans as fast as you can so that they have that to react to. You might even think about putting out draft community of interest maps. There are things out there that can be used as community of interest definitions, like the LA Times Project, to throw out there and say to the public, hey, this group put together this map of communities of interest. What do you think? Should we use these as building blocks or not? Obviously in LA they have the neighborhood election areas. San Diego has defined neighborhoods and community planning areas. Different parts of the state have different definitions of community of interest that can be compiled, and when you go there for a public hearing, throw it up on the map. Say, hey, this could sort of be a community of interest definition. Public, does it work? Does it not? What should be changed? That gives the public something to react against, and you'll get much more substantive feedback than if you simply say, tell us what your community is. And obviously it's better if you put those out in advance so that people can plan for what you're going to say. So when the public comes in to share their thoughts, there's 2 real points here. I won't go through the whole thing, but the public would really love it if after they make a whole bunch of input comments to you, especially when the draft map is out, that you give direction to your staff. So these need to be kind of action agendas. So the public can hear your reaction to their input. Did you agree and direct your staff to try incorporating their changes? Or did you say, no, we don't really go with that. That would do bad things over there. We're not going to go with it. The public definitely will be much more engaged and much more willing to come if they're hearing this feedback. And the other piece is, just for your own workload, at your open meetings, I would strongly encourage you to go through the input you've gotten by fax and email and in writing with requests, just as you go through and react to the people coming in to speak, for 2 reasons. 1, you want to be sure to take that into account, and 2, it will encourage people to share with you in writing, thus letting you get through your meetings faster. If they know that you're reading everything that comes in, and you're talking about it in your meetings, and you're giving direction to your staff based on these comments coming in, then they'll be fine when you say, can you just submit your letter and summarize in 10 seconds? If they've never heard you refer to any letter that ever came in, they're not going to give you their letter until they read it. So it makes a lot of sense. And you will certainly get some fantastic ideas from people who can't make it to your meetings. Okay. So that's the meat. Let me pause there and see if there's questions or reactions to that at this point. And then I'll go through the last piece fairly quickly.
Commissioner Filkins-Weber.
And just in the last few comments that you had made, in your experience, is it a recommendation that the commission, as we're in an input hearing and we're receiving public recommendations regarding drawing the map, that you're anticipating that the commission should be responding to the public suggestion during a meeting? I mean, is that what you're, in your experience, what would you make, what recommendation would you make to the commission as far as, because for instance, if you have 50 people, and how can you actually say, oh, that's a good idea, oh, that's a good idea, 50 times? So in practicality, how does it really work?
Well, it's a good question. Let me clarify a little bit. It's unlikely that you'll want to direct staff after every speaker. You'll want your staff keeping a list of things, and you'll probably all be keeping a list of things as the public's commenting, and then maybe at the end, go back through that list. Staff, please work to this. You may very well want to interact and clarify, and you'll get conflicting speakers. And you may want to ask them both or call them both up. This is one thing to be sure to do on these public input sessions is always agendize them as business meetings and let yourself have action, because your business meetings in these meetings will come together. So yeah, you may not engage with each one, but you'll want to go back through once the public is finished and give direction to your staff. And you may very well want to give your direction to your staff right then. One thing that almost certainly will be done is you'll be asking staff, okay, they've asked us to put this together. Can you give us a sense of what the ripple is on that? What would be the impact of uniting this neighborhood? And your staff hopefully can give you an off-the-head kind of ballpark. Obviously, they won't give you specifics until they go away and test it.
Commissioner Anchetta.
You raise the point that the public often may, or it may be easier for them to react to maps. How useful, if at all, do you think it would be if the Commission were to, in its various materials or on its website, just sort of publish both the current districts for all the appropriate bodies and prior maps? Obviously, that stuff is available, but should the Commission just sort of put it out there, so at least they can get a sense from the public that might not be able to sort of go to all the other places where they show up, that kind of information?
Well, I think I would, assuming that you build this kind of online atlas where people can go and look up data and look up the neighborhoods and print maps and draw on them for them, obviously it'd be easy to just throw those layers on there and people want to use it. I think early on you might be better off focusing on a map of communities of interest and kind of how they react to that from your perspective. Now, the other groups will throw in maps. I don't know who will do it, but MALDEF, the Asia Pacific Legal Center, Green Lining, those guys drew maps before, and we'll draw them this time. So as soon as those maps come out, they'll be submitted, there'll be records, you can post those. And that'll it may be a little safer than having something that the Commission is throwing out there and giving the impression you're starting from something. But you could certainly put up these ideas for communities of interest, because 90% of the state, you will not get any input from the public on their communities of interest, because the state's just too darn big. Those people. So you'll need to fill in the blanks as you draw your lines, and that may be something you can use.
Commissioner Baraba.
Yes, this has been really helpful. I guess the question is that you've had a lot of experience, but it hasn't been anything as large as what we're going to be facing, would be my guess. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it's just scale now. I've been through the multiple maps, and when I say consultant, I'm not saying me, because you're a long way through that.
But, my point is that scale can have an effect on what worked at a lower scale than at a larger scale. And I guess the question is I'm asking is can we expect that the scale at which we'll be working may raise some questions about this approach?
Well, it's possible, and it's one of the reasons I gave you that list at the beginning of definitely, don't take my word. There are lots of people that can give you comments on it, and many of them have drawn California plans. Obviously, anyone that's drawn a California plan was working for the legislature, but that doesn't mean they don't have some great insights to give you. So it's definitely worth bouncing that question off some of them. I think the dynamics are the same, and one thing that I learned in Arizona that I never realized is that the complexity of drawing a plan is driven by how many lines there are. I always thought, looking at this theoretically, that, well, Congress is higher profile. That's going to be more controversial and more difficult. And in California, there's 53 lines, so that's a lot of lines. It will be more difficult than your state Senate map unless you're nesting your assembly seats. So it really does come down to how many lines, and yes, scale matters, but the dynamics, I think, are similar. Where your community is going to focus on neighborhoods is where the lines go through the neighborhood. So, for example, way north, Redding, Eureka, you're going to draw with whole counties. There's just no reason not to. So they don't need to know how to use Maps to Online Redistricting to draw their neighborhood in.
Commissioner Filkins-Weber, and then Commissioner DiGiulio, and then Commissioner Aguirre and Blanco.
At what point in the process did Arizona actually define community of interest? And I see you have quite a number of definitions in here. Do you have a recommendation as an expert as to when this commission should do it? And that's it.
I would actually leave that discussion to your litigation counsel, because Arizona very consciously chose not to expand on the definitions, and then they adopted definitions when the judge ordered them to in the court process. So this presentation was actually done during the court process when the judge says you must adopt definitions. It is a big issue in terms of when you get to court to defend your plan, whether if you adopt definitions, then you apply them uniformly, and if you define something, that can box you in. And you may very well come into a community of interest that doesn't fit your definition, but when the people come in and talk about it, it matters. So there's no easy answer on whether or not to define beyond what's already in the initiative, obviously. You do have the advantage of your definitions in the initiative are definitely much more detailed than Arizona's were. So you may not want to, but that's an issue to discuss with your counsel, definitely.
Commissioner DiGiulio.
I think this is great. I think oftentimes we as a commission, we're kind of focused on this little box of what we need to do right now, and it's helpful to have our eyes open into things that we really need to consider as we go forward. I'm curious to get a little bit of your feedback in terms of, even as the presentation had said, as an alternative training options. Where we are, where you see us now, you've been watching this process, where you see us now, where we have made some decisions with the 9 regions, the 3 phases, the initial outreach. Are there any other alternatives that you could suggest to us that we haven't considered? A lot of this I see is happening kind of down the road a little bit. But where we are right now, are there any suggestions or ideas that we should be taking into consideration in terms of alternative training ideas?
You mean in terms of training for the commission or
I
training
guess
for the public?
When I saw this as alternative training ideas, I wasn't sure if this was training for us in terms of what will happen later, but I guess I would like to hear you bounce off any of your ideas of where we are at this point, if we're on track in terms of what you thought, or if there's any other any alternative ideas in terms of how we've initially approached our outreach and public input efforts at this point.
Sure, I see what you mean. Yeah, I was thinking this is more, I don't even know if it's training as much as just informational for all of you, but it wasn't aimed as being a public training. This is more just for your information, and hopefully useful for the people watching too. In terms of where you are now, I think the main lesson, or the main message I'd pass along is that you need to do your input hearings, but the second round of hearings will be much more useful and constructive for you. So the faster you can get through that first round and get a draft plan out, the better.
So maybe condense our first round.
Yeah, and I must admit, I, to some degree, lean towards Kathy Fong's comment to you of maybe the education outreach sessions are done by video, or depending on how much you want to get into them, you could actually make them input sessions. Where you do, half an hour or an hour of education at the beginning that people can come to or not if they don't care, and then an hour in actually start your input hearing rather than education outreach. Although now that the discussion today was more about having commissioners at those education outreach sessions, so they may turn into public input sessions anyways. But that's really the key thing is getting that input and getting that draft map, because you are going to run out of time. I cannot emphasize how swamped you're going to be from that point where you put out your draft map to getting the final, because there's going to be people wanting revisions. And I use Commissioner Yao's line all the time about you have 131 days to draw 177 districts, and that's from April 1.
Commissioner Aguirre, then Blanco, and Yao.
It's just a few related points. One is it's been suggested with some of our speakers, and as far as starting to draw the maps, whether you start from scratch with no lines at all, looking at population density and things like that, or whether you should start with previous maps, understanding that the ones from 2000 are really, kind of radical. So, and then also whether it makes sense to start out in the densest population areas and then work out from there, and maybe perhaps you could give us some comments on special challenges that are presented by Section 2 and Section 5 areas.
Certainly. I definitely agree with the idea that's been shared, and my suggestion would actually be two pieces. And very reasonable people will certainly disagree with me on this, so certainly there are other approaches. But the court in 73 and 91 both times put out very detailed reports of how they broke the state up into big regions, 5 or 6 regions, and then figured out how many districts fit in each region and drew those region by region. And I think that is a pretty good way to start the approach of something to get in front of the public, with one caveat of the Voting Rights Act has changed a lot since 73 and 91. And I think a big focus needs to be especially focusing on your Section 5 districts. You cannot retrogress, and you need to draw your Section 2 seats. And especially given the numbers that I showed you about the brick wall that the emerging populations ran into in 2001, you probably want to look at those very early and really start with obviously your Section 5 districts. DOJ will essentially tell you to start with those. But also look at where you have Section 2 issues and Section 2 concerns and draw those first. Now, you don't have to draw a Section 2 district that goes across the Sierras. So you're probably safe starting with the 73 and 91 approach to defining regions and then going straight to your voting rights issues. This is actually the triggers a thought that I meant to say earlier, too. In your outreach plan, you need to be thinking about Section 5. One of your early lists of cities had no Section 5 county cities in it. And I grew up right outside Watsonville. I grew up in Santa Cruz County. My mom taught at Watsonville High for many years. Don't go to Watsonville because you're literally across the river from a Section 5 county. Get input from Watsonville, but do it in North Monterey County if you want, because get into those Section 5 counties and be able to show DOJ that you went to the Section 5 counties and got input. If you go to Watsonville, it's almost daring Department of Justice. If you go to Watsonville without going to Monterey or Salinas, I should say, you're almost daring Department of Justice to, say, what are you thinking? So you definitely need to be aware of your 4 counties and take your hearings there.
We're getting close on time, so Commissioner Blanco and Commissioner Yao are in the stack. Or any other commissioners have questions or comments for Mr. Johnson? Commissioner Anchetta. Okay. Commissioner Blanco.
So this is following up a little bit on Commissioner Barraba's question. On Commissioner Barraba's point or question about scale. So I was listening closely to suggestion or your recounting of how this was done in Arizona, that in the input meetings themselves, at that meeting, our technical folks would be almost simultaneously taking some of the comments and doing projections and feeding them, in a sense, back to us on the spot. And and I'm not sure that's what you were saying, but there was an element of this almost very real-time back and forth that was going to happen at the input meetings as you described them, and so I'm wondering, so how many input meetings did Arizona have?
Well, they held a total of 57 between the 2 rounds.
Between the 2 rounds.
So yeah, the initial they didn't start like you did from blank slate. They started with this grid that was more or less a blank slate.
And what was the time frame for that? I just want to.
The time frame was I think they started in April, and then they ran through November. So they had a longer spread. And let me clarify what I was saying earlier, because I understand what you're saying. I didn't mean people would be drawing live. The interaction would be your tech team hopefully will be aware enough of the issues that when someone says something, they can say off the top of their head, well, we've looked at that in the past, and we know that the three options to incorporate that are probably along this lines. You're right. They can't be drawing live in the meeting, in part because the software is built-in checks to make sure you didn't miss something and there's no floating census block. But for California, those take 10 to 20 minutes to run. You don't want the commission sitting here and the public sitting here for 20 minutes. So you're definitely right. You're not going to be drawing maps live.
And you had 50-some?
57.
57.
Input hearings and business. It was all rolled at business meetings and input hearings and all that.
And how many, were there any Section 5?
The whole state.
The whole state is Section 5, right? So you're just assuming the whole map has to be checked against, you have to get pre-clearance for the whole
Yes.
map. And were there, how many Section 2, if you can, did you go from what to what in terms of Section 2 districts?
We had a very, very complicated voting rights situation. On Section 5, we had a district that was 76% Native American, but underpopulated by almost 20%, and there were no more Native Americans around to put in. So how do you that's the toughest part of Section 5, which is what do you do when retrogression is inevitable. We had a number of Section 2 situations, both legislative and congressionally. Could do a whole discussion about the Latino community actually came in and wanted the districts kind of cut slimmer than the voting rights experts said they should be cut because they wanted a shot at more seats. That decision then led to the big disputes, and I won't go into details because that would get 20 people coming in here to rebut me. But that decision and what came out of that is what led to the eventual Department of Justice objection. So they wrestled with all these issues in great detail, and actually the lead voting rights litigator in there is a Californian who was on that list of people you might talk to. And then the voting rights experts are national. But when I did like that you put the social sciences into your budget, because if I were you, I would do a racially polarized voting study day one.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's going to run you close to $200,000.
Commissioner Yao and then Commissioner Anchetta.
Two questions. From what I heard you in terms of structuring the input session, the public input session, is to have multiple maps. So in our particular case, if we simply do either a Senate or Assembly district map and a congressional map, that probably should be sufficient. Do we typically run those in parallel or run it separately, serially? What's your recommendation on that? And then the second question I have is, a lot of literature suggests that depending on where you start drawing the map, the districts will look very, very differently. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly on the second point, it's true. To some degree, the process that the courts described in 73 and 91 help with that by really giving you 5 starting points. But it also is a key thing to think about when you get to your draft map stage is you could spend months fine-tuning a draft map. Maybe you just want to put out 2 or 3 draft maps so that the commission doesn't debate and come down as saying this is our decision, this is where we're going forward from. Maybe just here's 3, and I mean 3 assembly maps, 3 congressional maps, or whatever number you seem to be coming to consensus in different groups around. That may be a way of getting your maps out and moving on, because the key thing with the draft map is to get it out and then get the public coming in about it. So serially, yes. I mean, one person can't draw all these plans. There's a famous line in the transcript of Arizona, which, as you're saying, is a much smaller jurisdiction to deal with, where the transcript says, "Thud, heard and back." commission, I think we just lost a consultant. It's because it is crazy, and you're going to have these teams rotating through, so they will be the public will be talking about both maps at the same time in all likelihood, but you will have different maps on the screen in front of you.
So our final questions will be from Commissioner Anchetta, Parvenu, and Filkins-Weber, and then we'll be wrapping this presentation.
Thank you. And this has been enormously helpful, so I'm really glad to see it. And we'll see more of you, obviously, in terms of your comments. And I would encourage you, because we didn't go through the criteria section of your presentation, to definitely get engaged for either presenting public comment or written comment as well. So I have two questions. And this actually goes to one of the criteria, but I wanted to see if this is an issue we need to flag for the future. There's a particular definition of compactness in the Act, referring to such that nearby areas of population are not bypassed for a more distant population. Is there anything unusual or special about that language that we need to pay attention to? Because I know obviously there are various tests out there, but just in terms of flagging it as a question, do you think there's something we should be looking at specifically because of that language?
It is fairly specific. If I might, that theory of compactness actually comes from Tony Quinn, and so it might be better to bounce that question off of Tony.
I was wondering. Okay,
So,
okay.
yeah.
So we can flag it for future discussion.
Yeah, and it is simpler than a lot of the computer-based compactness tests.
And then the second question, and I hope you don't mind doing this, because I think just in the spirit of disclosure and transparency and things, also you're representing the Rose Institute today, and the Institute's done fabulous work, in my opinion. I think you do have a private sector hat that you wear in terms of consulting. Could you just mention that and just distinguish between the two? And if they're entirely separate, that's fine. But so we know.
Oh, of course.
That one.
Yeah. And actually, I mentioned this back in Claremont at one point.
Sure.
But yeah, so we do research as the Rose Institute. We used to do contract work and do it all as Rose Institute. But as you've learned, this gets political, and the college at one point kind of said, can you do the contracting outside? So we formed, our company's called National Demographics.
Right.
And in the RP process, you'll get all the details about those. That's why I left it out.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. Commissioner Parvenu has conceded his time. Commissioner Filkins-Weber, the last word.
What is racially polarized voting study?
Well, you'll do a whole session on this, but the 10-second answer is that the voting rights law, Section 2 of the voting rights law, focuses on really effective districts where the minority population has the ability to elect, and what percentage number gets you to an effective district. And racially polarized voting studies are at the core of figuring that out. So I could spend 4 hours on it, okay. and you'll spend a lot of time on that in your voting rights training.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
All right. So any closing remarks?
No, you have the packet. The last slide is kind of my closing remarks. Just remember, as bumpy and rough as this is going to be, this is historic, and you guys really are the first time doing this in California. And so as bumpy as it gets, it's still better than the old way. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. At this time, our commission will be going on to recess for a lunch break. We will reconvene at 1 p.m. in the same location.